Well, it's the 32nd Sunday of the year. We're getting near the end of what we call the liturgical year that ends at the end of November. Then we begin Advent, then we begin a new liturgical year. Now, in this 32nd year, we see a focus on two women, one in the Gospel and one in the first reading. The one in the Gospel we don't know much about, but Jesus sees her from a distance, and she's a very poor woman, she's a widow or, a poor woman, and she puts a couple of coins in the temple, giving box or the treasury, and Jesus said all she had to live on. Okay, and he praises her. And then likewise in the first reading we have an Elijah. Elijah is asking from a woman who's quite destitute, who had really only one meal between her and starvation. For her and her son, he says, share with me. In fact, give me something first, and then you can eat. And these things should be shocking. They shock us. And that's not something to just say, well, we have to explain this away. No, we got to stay with the shock a little and say, this is shocking. What's going on here, and what do we need to learn from these things? Because, to us moderns, that a woman would give whatever little she had left to the temple, or that Elijah would cruelly ask a woman and her son to give way to him and feed him first and then trust God for the rest. It's like, oh, that's irresponsible. It strikes us as irresponsible, as presumptive, all kinds of things. We can get really indignant about it very quickly. So, what are we dealing with here? Let's enter into the shock a little bit and look at these two women. We don't know much about the woman in the gospel except what the Lord observes. She's obviously destitute. She still remains generous to God's house. And there just seems to be this implication that she's living in a very trusting way, that God will take care of her. All right. Now, the woman, though, in the first reading, we know a little bit more about her. We know that she's very destitute. She's a widow. She has a son. The implication is that the son is young. He can't go out and work and find things or whatever. So, and that they're at the point of starvation. They're in the middle of a famine. Okay. So we're going to look a little bit more at the woman in the first reading. But before we do that, let's look a little bit at our own situation and see why maybe some of this stuff shocks us. There's some very paradoxical things about wealth that come up in this reading, and a lot of soul searching to do for us. In a way, we've never lived in a more affluent culture. Even the poor among us live pretty well. Most of them have electricity and running water, which is clean, purified running water. They have some, not all, but many have air conditioning and televisions, and well, you get the point. That's not true of the destitute and the poor in some other parts of the world, or certainly in antiquity. They didn't have anything close to this. So my point, though, is this, that we live in a very affluent culture. Lots of consumer goods are available to us, fairly cheap, that we can acquire. Lots of comfort, lots of the things I've mentioned. And you would think, that with all this money and prosperity, we wouldn't have a care in the world. The thinking sometimes if I could just get a little more money, pay off some of these bills and stuff, I wouldn't have a care in the world. But the paradox is that's not true. The richer, the more wealthy we get, the more cares we have. The book of Proverbs says that the rest of a laborer is sweet, but as for the rich man, his wealth affords him no rest. The more you have, the more you have to lose. The more you have, the more you could be impacted by something. There's something strangely enslaving about owning things. They end up owning us. We're too anxious. We have too much to lose. We get lost in lots of anxieties and fears. Now, if you were to look, at our culture, I'm saying these statistics just sort of off the cuff. I don't know that I have all the data, but I do know that, with all this wealth that we have today, you'd think that everyone would everything's peachy and no one worries about a thing. But many of the population, upwards of close to half, take psychotropic meds to kind of keep them from being so anxious or so stressed out. And then the other half is drinking. No, I don't know, but you know what I'm saying. There's a tendency for us to think that if I just had a little more money, I wouldn't have a care in the world. But if you really study this, it's not true. I think Bishop Barron's pointed out, you know, the three tallest buildings in Chicago are all insurance companies, and our buildings say a lot about us. You go to a medieval city, the tallest and most prominent building would have been the church. You know, very different perspectives. You know. Now, one, you know, being medieval, being oriented towards staying close to God and pointing to the world to come. The other one, very, very intensely focused on keeping this world safe and secure. Okay. All right. With that in mind, you know, I want to say there's also a very strange paradox when it comes to poverty. Now, I speak here in a very general way. You know, people have sometimes criticized me for saying what I'm about to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. That it's very interesting. There's a certain paradox. I've already hinted at it with the quote from Proverbs. But that there comes a point when poverty is almost freeing in a very strange, paradoxical way. It's pretty hard to steal from a man who has nothing. It's pretty hard to intimidate a man who has nothing to lose. You know, we who have a lot of wealth, and not just we individuals, but the church, we're easily intimidated. You might lose, you know, public opinion might go against you. You might, you know, die from COVID, you know, well, fear after fear after fear. But, you know, when you're living poor, it's like, there's a certain thing, well, what do I have to lose? These things don't preoccupy you as much. You know, there's a strange song I'm going to quote from it. It's not from some religious hymn. It's from Paul McCartney, I think, in the album Band on the Run. He says that there's you know, when you live in the jungle, you don't use money, you don't pay rent. And he goes on to say, you don't even know the time of day, but it doesn't matter. You know, you're living kind of moment to moment, day to day, hand to hand. And so again, there's this sort of strange, I'll put it in quotes, freedom that comes. It's very hard to intimidate a person who has nothing to lose. And you might think they're the most anxious of all. Well, maybe some of them are, but there's just something strange. And that will come into play then in this reading today. I want to just lay that out as a background and ask you to ponder it. The more you have, and the more you have to lose, the more you begin to get, the world gets its hooks in you, and you're less free to move about and just speak plainly or live very intentionally. You're afraid of losing all these little things you've acquired. Whereas if you have less to lose, and you're freer. And I don't recommend selling everything and living on a park bench. That's not recommendable. That's not even, I would say it's not even responsible. You should put it again. We ought to do everything we can to resist the mesmerizing effect of wealth. And the church too. See? We, in a way, have too much to lose. We have big buildings, big assets. We have a lot of contracts with the federal government through Catholic Charities and all these, you know, whatever. We don't want to lose all this stuff. And in having too much to lose, we get very quiet. We're not speaking prophetically like we should. We're not always preaching the gospel the way we should because we're afraid. And Jesus had nowhere to lay his head. You know, my kingdom is not of this world, you see. And he had that freedom. And so did the prophets and others. Okay, let's get into the actual story. And, you know, we have a woman here. It says, as the reading opens, it says, in those days, Elijah the prophet went to Zarephath, and he arrived at the entrance of the city, and a widow was gathering sticks there. And he called out to her. Now, we see that she's a widow. We find out later she has a son. She's the definition of poverty, you know, poor and orphaned, you know. I mean, she's got an orphan son, and she's a widow. It doesn't get more poor than that in the biblical, you know, language. She's gathering sticks, probably again to light a little fire to cook some bread and so on. Now, what I just want to say, just in quick passing about this is that there's a kind of a double desire going on. There's going to be this understanding that she's obviously hungry, so is Elijah. That's the physical hunger. But then there's the allegorical hunger that we don't want to overlook, namely that there's a hunger. Now, her hunger represents the hunger we have for getting through things in this life, all right? That desire, for food and drink and the basic essentials. But we also have Elijah, whose desire represents God's desire. Now, I'm putting that in quotes, not to offend against philosophical principles of the unmoved mover. But in the Bible, God does have a kind of a passionate desire. And the way he set things up, there are some things he can't have. And, for example, our yes, our trust, our love, our obedience. God's kind of put a little fence around our heart or a room, and he only knocks. He doesn't barge in and steal our freedom. So there's a desire that God has for us. Again, I'll put that in quotes. I'm not here to get into a long theological discussion about the mystery of time and how it interacts with God's sovereignty and omniscience. I'm just going to say that there's a certain desire that God has. He spoke to the woman at the well, give me something to drink. On the cross, he said, I thirst. You see. And, somehow, even as God, there is this, put it in quotes, desire. And so, at this intersection of God's desire for us and our desire for him comes the Holy Mass, Holy Communion. And God's desire meets our desire. And that's the goal anyway, right? I don't want to say much more because I got to move on. I don't want to go on forever. But there is this desire that's portrayed. We're all hungry in some sense. Now, you'll note the dimensions of her poverty. When Elijah says, please bring me a small cupful of water, she left to get it. But then he called out after her, but please also bring along a bit of bread. And she answered, that the Lord, my God, your God lives. I have nothing baked. There's only this little handful of flour in my jar and a little oil in the jug. Basically, I was just now collecting sticks to cook our last meal for myself and my son. Then we're just in starvation. Well, we'll just wait for death to come. So she's utterly destitute. This is her last meal. Her last meal. I don't want to develop much further to say, but except to say that she's utterly deprived of everything that we most need. She's in a famine. She has almost no food left, or just enough for a last meal. No guarantee that anything will come, because everyone else is in famine. No big Red Cross helicopter is going to come and drop some stuff, All right, you see the vision here. Just see the picture. Real, not just poverty, which is actually a counsel, but real destitution. All right. Now, I want to argue as we move into the next stage that poverty sort of frees her to take up a risk, to take up God and his offer. Because Elijah, almost to a simple worldly appearance, acts almost cruelly. He says to her, well, I hear you. You're in bad shape. But it says here, do not be afraid. Okay? Do not be afraid. Go and do as you propose. Have this meal with your son. But first, make me a little cake and bring it to me. And then you can prepare something for yourself and your son. What's this guy, a megalomaniac? Was he egocentric? Does he not care about anybody but himself? I mean, what are we dealing with here, you see? But then, he makes a promise. And the promise is, for the Lord God of Israel says, the jar of flour will not go empty, nor the jug of oil run dry, until the day when the Lord sends rain upon the earth. In other words, look, you take care of me today as God's prophet. And I promise you that God will not be outdone in generosity, and he will take care of you through this famine. I think Jesus sort of hints at this passage when he says, no one who gives a cup of cold water to one of these little ones, these prophets of mine go out, no one who gives this will lack their reward. They will receive a prophet's reward. All right. Now, it's called faith. Oh, but this woman's destitute. What are you talking about faith? There's a saying today that you can't deal with people's souls until you deal with their bellies. I'm sorry. That's a secular, worldly point of view. Even the poorest of the poor need to be summoned to faith. Faith is what saves us, and the poor can and should be a part of the solution. I'm talking about the destitute here. We've got to understand that even those who are in a terrible way need to be summoned to faith. I do that all the time when I visit hospitals. And I call a person to faith. Either God is calling and preparing you to come see him at the judgment seat, or he may make you well. But the point is, just pour out your heart to God at this point. Do whatever you can to say, God, my life is in your hands. Oh, well, I won't say these things are sick and they don't feel well. No, even more. And yet, too often today, we just sort of give little carte blanche and we just sort of dismiss, and we don't preach to the poor the way we should. They're not just hungry physically or materially, they are, but they're like we are. They're still hungry spiritually. And so there's an obligation to still summon even the poor to the faith. Jesus says many who are last are going to be first. Notice he says many, not all. It's not about, well, I earn less than $32,000. I guess I qualify. Am I poor? And do I just get a blank check to walk into heaven? No, it's not that simple. And so everyone needs to repent of their sins. Everyone needs to put greater trust in God. And we do a very bad thing if we only deal with the material needs, if you will, the corporal works of mercy, and neglect the spiritual works of mercy. Many of us don't need as many of the corporal works of mercy, at least right now. We may need it in the future when we're in a hospital bed. But we certainly, all of us, need the spiritual works of mercy. Okay. Now, enough said, but he engages her faith. It's not just he's saying, well, I know you're going to die tomorrow or the next day, you're going to die of starvation. But look, just I get that. It's too bad for you. But get me a little cake and bring it to me. Okay, it sounds cruel, but then he says, but I make you a promise. If you do, God will take care of you. He'll not be outdone in generosity. Now here we come then to the kind of freedom that she has. She says to herself, well, look, if God's going to give me this promise, maybe I'll take the risk. I'll take God up on his offer. Some of my friends will just say, well, that's just pie in the sky, whatever. But at the end of the day, I'll take the risk. And I'll go ahead and trust God in this. Now, how does she come to this point? Most of us would be like, well, this is irresponsible. And because she has very little to lose. One more day on this earth. One more meal. I'll share some of it, whatever. I mean, I just know that if for some reason God doesn't come through for me, I'm going to be dead in, a few weeks anyway. Why not take the risk? She had very little to lose and a lot to gain. And so God kind of brings her to this point. And she takes the risk. And you know how the story ends. We'll get to that in a moment. But I simply say to you that there's something about her journey that gave her a freedom. Whereas too many of us would not even consider such a thing. We have bills to pay or whatever, and someone asks us to be generous to some cause. No way, man, I got to pay my bills. And maybe from a purely worldly and financial point of view, that would make sense. But God says, no, I still want you to give the tithe. The first tenth of your income comes to me, says the Lord, And I'll pour you out a blessing if you're faithful to it. But at the end of the day, that's just, nope, can't do it. Now, I'm not going to get into a long discussion about tithing. I'm just going to say that somewhere in all of this, even when we're needy, it may not be about money. It may be about our time. It may be about any number of things. I'm very, very busy, but somebody really needs my attention right now. Can I just trust God? He'll work these other things out for me, and I do this. What's responsible? What isn't, you see? The richer and the more busy and plugged into the world we get, frantic, running around, chasing butterflies, the less free we become to simply say, well, look, why not? I'll give it a go. Give it a go. All right. You start to see, therefore, she said, all right, fine. She takes Elijah up on the risk. And again, as we come then finally to this last segment of the story, it simply says, she went and did as he asked, and she was able now to eat for a year, she and her son as well. The jar of flour did not go empty, and the jug of oil did not run dry, as foretold through Elijah. And the famine broke within a year, and things were back to, better times. Wow, talk about freedom, heroic freedom. See? And it's a freedom that we often lack. There's a lot of things in this story. All I can do is just leave you with some homework, and I have to leave myself with some homework. For all of our thoughts that all of our wealth will make us happy or whatever, it never works. It's not so much what you earn, it's what you spend. And there's a lot of layers to this problem. But the more we get, the more anxious we become. The more we have to lose, the more anxious we become. There's a certain freedom. Now, this doesn't mean go sell everything and live on a park bench, but it does mean that we should learn to kind of pare down and have less so that we really have more room to maneuver, less things to be anxious about. Something worth thinking about. It's very paradoxical. And it's not like a mathematical formula. But I'll tell you finally this, that there's going to come a day for all of us when we finally have nothing to lose on our deathbed. And, I've seen people through this process, but they finally come to a place where I've got nothing left here. My wife, my children may still be here and grandchildren, but I can't really help them now. My wife is gone. I've had to sell my house, or I've got really nothing here. All I want to do now is just take God up in His offer. I'll give you heaven if you ask for it. And you let me do the work I need to do to get you in here. Great. What do I have to lose? Now, I wish that deathbed conversions were more common than they are. I'm not really talking about a deathbed conversion, but you and I are on a journey. I've given things back to the Lord already. I know you have. I've given back certain loved ones, people I thought I couldn't. How would I live in my life without my parents present or whatever? Well, I've had to give them back to the Lord. My sister, I've had other relatives, grandparents, others. You have too. And then we begin to give back some of our health and some of our hair and, all that stuff. And little by little, we just set aside the things of the world, and it becomes less enticing, and we become more free to say yes to God. So there is a process here. And I don't try to tell you to rush it, but let God do what He needs to do, because we do ultimately have to come to a point where we are able to finally say, really, Lord, I surrender everything. We sing that hymn in church, I surrender all, but we don't mean it. No way do I surrender all, But finally we come to a point where we can really say, I surrender all. All I want now, Lord, is to be with you, see? And I just take the risk. I've surrendered everything, and I will go across the valley of the shadow of death, confident, knowing that you're going to lead me. And I will see, by your grace and mercy, joys unspeakable and glories untold. All right, well, I've gone on too long, but this is a complicated issue, and it's a human problem. We're very easily caught in the hooks of this world, and the church too. Honest to gosh, I think a lot of our problems today come down to we have too much to lose. We're all worried about liability, access to power. Jesus had nowhere to lay his head. I don't mean get rid of all of our church buildings, but I'm just saying let's try to be less attached to worldly promises and power and money. Let's try to be freer to preach the gospel. So it's a question for the church. It's a question for you, and for me, it's a question for every one of us. Amen.